Hi. Well, it's time to start thinking about how we're going to put together that first essay, which I think can be really stressful when you're starting out a new semester and a new instructor. So, I want to talk about some drafting strategies that are based off of things I picked up over the years teaching and also off some ideas from Anne Lamott. So Anne Lamott's idea is that we need to be really clear about the line between when we're creating and when we're starting to edit. And that oftentimes we get stuck as writers because we're trying to do the two things at the same time. They happen in different parts of your brain, so they often don't mix very well. And she comes up with three phases of drafting. I've added on one more. With a separate brainstorming phase at the beginning. So the quotes that you'll see in this video are excerpts from Shitty First Drafts, which is a chapter from Anne Lamott's Guide to Writing Bird by Bird. And you can check out the PDF of a segment of that chapter if you'd like. So brainstorming. I think of that as the place where you're just wildly creating. And this is a link to some strategies from UNC at Chapel Hill that has a lot of different ways of coming at it. I think the one thing to keep in mind from my perspective is that often brainstorming and free writing are presented as the same thing. It's as it is in this handout in the attachment. Or the link, but I encourage you to try brainstorming where you aren't creating sentences, because that can tempt people to start editing, spell checking, all the things that you should be doing probably later on in your drafting phases. So again, I can say it over and over again. Creating happens in one part of your brain. Editing usually happens in a different part of your brain. And while you may feel like you can do those at the same time, you're actually switching back and forth. And oftentimes, because of the way that we teach writing in schools, you end up mostly editing and don't ever generate enough cool creative content. So the downdraft is what Anne Lamott calls one of the first drafts that you put together. And I love her idea that almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere, start by getting something, anything down on paper. A friend of mine says that the first draft is the downdraft. You just get it down. She also calls these shitty first drafts, if you don't mind my language. And she reminds us that all good writers write them. It's just almost impossible to come up with something that's perfect and polished the first time. But I find that beginning writers often feel like that's where they need to be starting and get frustrated with themselves if it doesn't look the way they want it to on the first pass. So writing takes a lot of patience and a lot of iterations. You have to keep coming back to it. Lamott's advice is to let your downdraft play. She also calls it a child's draft, where you just let it out and let it play around, roll around in the mud and say whatever it needs to say. She does admit that, the early drafting is really painful. At one point, she describes in her book how she hopes that she doesn't get hit by a bus at some point, because somebody might come into her house and find one of her early drafts and know that she really isn't a writer at all. So, I think we all kind of get that imposter syndrome with writing, even if you've been doing it for a long time or even doing it professionally. So be patient with yourself and let your downdraft play. The second draft is the updraft. According to Lamott, you fix it up. You try to say what you have to say more accurately. And in this case, this is where really, once you have that first big pile of ideas, where you can start to figure out, cutting what matches your thesis and what doesn't. You can start breaking your ideas into paragraphs. You can begin placing and integrating your source material. You can start choosing more specific and interesting language. Figure out how you want to frame your essay. What image do you want to start with and conclude with? Making sure that you fulfill the requirements of the assignment, spell checking, correcting obvious errors. So I often find that students like to start out outlining, and they think of outlining as brainstorming, and it really isn't. Oftentimes, outlining is what you start to do here at the point where you've already accumulated a lot of material to start putting into that structure. There's not one wrong way or right way to do it. I just encourage you to try putting off outlining as long as possible if you've never tried it this way before. The dental draft is what Lamott calls that third draft, and that's where you're checking every tooth, she says, to see if it's loose or cramped or decayed or even, God help us, healthy. Fingers crossed, right? So this is where the proofreading happens, where you're polishing the fine details. But that's really an ongoing process. I had a professor in college who said that he never submitted a poetry for publication until he had written it, drafted it, proofread it, put it in a drawer in his desk, and with a date at the top, he'd come back to it a year later, pull out that draft, and go through the process again, especially the proofreading. So it's something that is best done in multiple sessions if you can, with a break, so you come back to it with fresh eyes. And really taking time to consider and trying to integrate the advice that you'll get from others along the way. So drafting isn't a straight line. And oftentimes people get stuck or feel like they, once they've already done brainstorming, they can't go back. But it's actually an excellent strategy that if you feel like you're a little stuck or you want to explore something a little bit more in your draft, go back and try brainstorming on that particular topic again, or try free writing again. This can help you generate more ideas. Students sometimes glare at me when I say this, but if you are short of your page length, for instance, in the essay, go back to the beginning and brainstorm some more things and try free writing and see what comes up. So set yourself a timer. I do this a lot in my work. I set a timer for a certain amount of time that I'm going to work, and then I set myself a timer for a little bit of a break. So we need those. And even if time is short, sometimes most of the time I'm way more productive if I've been able to give myself a break. And if you're an artist, try, to play around with that different way of coming at the topic, maybe an illustration or create a poem or pick out something on your guitar that seems to express what's going on with the assignment. Go crazy. Oftentimes switching to a different mode can be helpful. The most basic one is switching, between a computer, maybe trying handwriting with pen and paper. Talking to somebody about the assignment can be helpful. Even describing the assignment to somebody who doesn't know what it is can be really helpful. You can also, this is one thing I do, I use the voice to text feature on my laptop or on my phone to generate a ton of material, because we can all speak so much more quickly than we can type. And I also like to go for a walk. So, which I learned this from a conference I went to once, that kinesthetic learners, people who like to learn by doing or working physically with their hands with models, that even if they're walking, that's enough movement to help that part of their brain kick in. And so I like to go for a walk. I think about, whatever project I'm working on, and then I have my phone ready to record a voice memo of ideas, which actually is what I did in coming up with my plan for this presentation today. A real basic one too is to try a different setting. If you can, move to another room. Sometimes I just try even a different chair. Turn the music or TV on or off if you have the possibility of doing that. Sometimes that new perspective can be really helpful. My biggest piece of advice is to let you know that writing isn't magic. Most beginning writers come into English 101 feeling like they don't know how to find the right words to express their ideas. And I just want to tell you that most people struggle with finding the perfect word. And writing well isn't something that you're born with. It's a skill. So you'll get better as you practice, as you get feedback, as you learn more about all the different pieces of academic traditions that we're going to be talking about this semester. So that's why we allow revisions in this class. Your job is to do your best, complete essays on time so you can get feedback and keep moving forward this semester. And we're here to help. Good luck.